now we come to a story which is part of this tone that we were unfortunately bemoaning
Yes.
at the beginning of this month's watching brief, and that is a series of stories seemingly that have come. I don't know if this is part of an upsurge in a market, or if this is just a trend in reporting, but seemingly highlight a rather disturbing trend to try and recover human remains, mummified human remains. So the story that came to my attention was the story of 800-year-old mummy stolen from crypt in St. Michan's.
I
Michan's?
think it's Michan.
Michan's?
Michan.
Michan's
Mm.
church in Dublin.
Someone will
But
correct. Someone will correct us below the line.
someone will definitely correct us. But the other story that I know was you were particularly concerned about was stolen mummy feet that had been hidden in a set of speakers, and were recovered at Cairo airport. Uh,
Yes.
this is a really odd development, and I can't help but wonder: is this just coincidental, or do you think there genuinely is a market for this stuff that is usually invisible?
Well, I mean, obviously, the coincidence of the St. Michan's story coming within, a day or two of the Cairo airport seizure, they're completely unconnected, obviously.
Yeah. Well, yes, yes.
Uh, but I think it does show that heritage crime can take many forms,
Hmm.
and sometimes it can vary between the apparently sort of ghoulish wish to break into tombs and graves. I mean, I used to live just down the road from Nunhead Cemetery in London, and there were issues there with tombs being broken open and people either removing bones and putting them on the floor for whatever reason, or maybe possibly taking them. We don't know because
Hmm.
they weren't recorded before they were broken into.
Hmm.
Um, so that is there is a sort of subculture of people who do this sort of stuff. Very small, group
Hmm.
probably.
Hmm.
Um, but you only have to go back to antiquarian times when people were drinking mummy liquor, and a mummy was something that you brought back from your grand tour if you went to Egypt for your health, for the warm dry weather.
Well, mummies were also used as ballast in ships.
They were
They were snorted. You could, like
grind up the.
powdered snuff kind of thing.
Yep,
Put them on the back
yep.
of your hand. Quite grim things, but no one tends to do that these days. And it's interesting that, for example, in the case of the St. Michan's church in Dublin,
Mm,
um, doesn't seem to be a clear motivation.
no,
Supposedly, this was the body of a crusader that was turned
yes,
over, and his head had been removed. And the vicar of Christchurch Cathedral group of parishes, of which St. Michan's is part, Archdeacon David Pierpoint, said that he is upset and disappointed that the church has been targeted again by vandals. The crypt was also vandalised back in 1996. The actions of these people are devastating and sacrilegious. We are upset at the amount of damage that has been caused. And really, I think this comes back to, this is actually something. This touches on something which goes to the heart um, of an issue that lots of people don't seem to necessarily fully grasp outside the realm of archaeology. That there is this semi-serious joke that goes around where people sort of say, what's the most recent grave that you've ever excavated? You grave robbing
yeah,
archaeologist.
yeah,
Um, but the fact of the matter is that archaeologists don't. We tend not to just handle human remains for the sake of it. And
absolutely
when they
not.
are
No,
handled, they're handled in a very particular and careful way. And in the past,
yeah,
we've highlighted these questions of best practice or questionable practice when it comes to, for example, bodies and remains on battlefield sites being
indeed.
excavated for TV shows. And this is really where.
Nazi war diggers.
Yeah, I was trying to be polite.
Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, but this is really where I find myself wondering, um, genuinely wondering, because I can't quite mentally connect with this perspective, but wondering whether or not there is in fact something lacking out there in terms of general public education about the handling of the dead. And the reason I say that is that obviously, unfortunately, not that long ago, I had to deal with my mum passing, And once you go when you're going through that process, it's very clear that there are ways of dealing with this stuff that are managed carefully, often for the mental and emotional well-being of the family, but essentially also because you're not allowed to do certain things with the dead. But outside those moments when I'm talking about, for example, taking them on a road trip or something. You're not allowed to do that legally. But outside of those moments when you have to actually deal with the recently deceased in your immediate vicinity or your family, there's not much education about handling remains. And I wonder whether the reason why more people don't get annoyed or upset about this outside the community of archaeology is because we don't really have a mortuary culture, as it were, in Britain. Does that make any sense? If you see what I mean?
I see where you're going with that. I mean, I think obviously the most knowledge I have on in this particular area is dealing with military casualties, and there it's very highly regulated if it's done properly.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that doesn't stop people not doing it properly for
No.
whatever reason.
No.
There are persistent rumours that reoccur every now and again of, for example, human remains from the World War One battlefields that are made available on, the words dark web are normally mentioned,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
through private networks,
Mm-hmm.
possibly. The idea of I mean, gruesome though it sounds, and why anybody would want to do this, but the skull still wearing its helmet, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually,
again, I've heard stories of that kind of thing being made available.
Well, and funnily enough, actually, in another later segment in this month's Watching Brief, we're going to be touching on this collecting culture in that sense, as well, aren't we? Yeah, yeah.
But no, I mean, when it comes specifically to human remains, there was a case recently of a private collection of artifacts built up by a school teacher who was doing amateur archaeology, apparently to quite a high standard, but amateur archaeology in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. And he had died recently. His widow was wanting to sell his collection through an auction house, and it included some human remains from an early medieval burial ground.
Yeah.
And a lot of archaeologists got very upset by this, saying that the first of all, the collection should have gone to a public body, it shouldn't have gone to an auction house, and then also how distasteful it was to be selling human remains.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, as it turns out, there is actually no legal prohibition on selling human remains.
No.
What there are legal prohibitions on are certain treatments of human remains.
Mm-hmm.
But
and often this is essentially connected with ideas of decency, isn't it?
Indeed.
So I think we've touched on in the past the idea that some of the Home Office provisions about excavation of human remains was to prevent, a lady passing out in the streets having seen a skeleton, this kind of thing.
Absolutely, the idea that you have to have everything screened from the public from accidental view.
But I mean, obviously I'm making slight light of that, but. The reason why I say that is that essentially there's been no provision for this type of handling of human remains because it's never really wanted to be acknowledged that it happens. It's one of those things where the lawmakers don't want to countenance that there are people out there who would deal in human remains in that sense.
No, and also
haven't historically wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the St Michan's case, the immediate thought you have, if you've read any tabloid newspapers, you either get the words black mass, or goth. Somebody who lives a sort of hardcore goth lifestyle, or somebody who's into Satanism and black magic, as a cultural expression of their life, might want to have human body parts like that. I have to say, there's absolutely no evidence for that. No, they weren't graffitiing pentangles everywhere.
No.
Or whatever. And these kind of things, like vandalism to graves in cemeteries that appears random rather than specifically designed to offend, and we'll come on to that in another story later too. But it's not. It's done for what they perceive as the larks and the giggles.
Well, there's that, but also I think in the case of, for example, the Cairo remains, it looks as though that could be for, at best, collection, at worst, some sort of
Trafficking.
well, some sort of well, trafficking, but in terms of a commodity, something that can be broken down and used as an ingredient in something or something else.
Well, again, that's possible. There have again been stories about folk, certain kinds of African folk medicine and so on in Western cities.
And also some certain parts of China and the
Indeed.
South Asian continent.
Indeed. So, I mean, the destination for these the mummy parts that were seized in Cairo. I mean, it's obvious they were being trafficked because they were deliberately hidden, and in fact, they were picked up by the airport X-ray machine.
Yeah.
But for what purpose they're being trafficked, we don't know yet. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't gone to court, and we don't know who was responsible and why they were doing it. But the apparent initial destination, at least, was Belgium.
Yeah, yeah. The Live Science article that covers the Cairo story says here that trade in Egyptian antiquities is strictly forbidden, of course, and the removal of objects from the country without express permission of antiquities authorities carries a fine and a prison sentence of up to 2 years, which is actually quite light. I thought that'd be heavier in Egypt, considering the Ministry of Antiquities and how it tends to behave very publicly. To enforce this law, a special archaeological unit, the team that identified the recently discovered mummy parts, operates at Cairo airport, the ministry reported. Despite these precautions, trafficking in stolen artifacts persists. In 2016, objects worth an estimated $50 million were illegally shipped from Egypt to the US.
The US alone.
To the US alone, yeah. This represents the highest annual value of trafficked Egyptian artifacts in 20 years. And it's interesting, though, that these body parts, notably some feet and I think bits of torso as well from 2 individuals, 2 mummies, these are being classed as artifacts as well in that sense. It doesn't look as though they're, I mean, obviously, it says here, including animal and human remains, the Egyptian law on protection of antiquities, enacted in 1983, covers that. But they are classed along with a gold sculpture or a cat mummy or something like that. It's interesting.
Yes.
That's what they are.
And I think we have to remember that, and again, I think we covered it certainly on the pipeline. I think we've covered it on Watching Brief on a number of occasions. You have to say at the same time, as this is going on, we've got the sale in auction houses of things with, shall we say, legally questionable provenances, as we saw in the case of Sakemka, the sale of Sakemka in a few years ago from Northampton Museum. The legal situation around that is still unclear.
Yeah. Just one final point then, just going back to the church in Dublin. Just to find the final quote here was that, but also the crypt will have to close, so tourists will not be able to visit. It is very frustrating. I would appeal to anyone with information to contact the Garda, and that's basically where we're at.
I think we'd echo that. I mean, wherever you are in the world, if you're aware of a heritage crime, let the authorities know.
Yeah, definitely.